In the fog-drenched streets of Victorian London, a brilliant American military surgeon committed an act of unspeakable violence. No one suspected that behind his distinguished medical career lay a shattered mind consumed by paranoid delusions, and that his darkest hours would secretly shape the greatest dictionary in human history from inside a locked cell. This is the story of Dr. William Chester Minor and the grim reality of Broadmoor Asylum. Hello and welcome. Please be aware that this episode is highly graphic, containing references to severe mental illness, extreme self-mutilation, and historical medical abuse. In the early hours of February 17, 1872, a thick, suffocating fog blanketed the streets of Lambeth, a sprawling and impoverished district in South London. George Merritt, a 34-year-old brewery stoker and father of 6, was making his usual pre-dawn walk to work. He had no enemies and carried no wealth, making him an unlikely target for violence in the gaslit shadows. As Merritt turned down Belvedere Road, hurried footsteps echoed behind him. Without warning, a well-dressed man stepped through the mist, drew a heavy-caliber revolver, and fired multiple shots into Merritt's back and neck. The innocent stoker collapsed onto the damp cobblestones, succumbing to his injuries almost instantly, leaving his pregnant wife a widow. The shooter made no attempt to flee, simply waiting in the freezing damp as the echoing gunshots drew local constables to the bloody scene. When Scotland Yard detectives arrived to take the murderer into custody, they expected to find a desperate local thug or an intoxicated dock worker. Instead, they were confronted by a man of obvious wealth and education. The suspect spoke with a refined, patrician accent, carrying himself with an aristocratic posture that deeply unsettled the arresting officers. A search of his tailored clothing and nearby lodgings quickly revealed his true identity, delivering a shocking twist to the investigation. The man in handcuffs was not a product of London's criminal underworld, but Dr. William Chester Minor, a 37-year-old American aristocrat, Yale graduate, and a highly decorated former surgeon for the United States Union Army. During his interrogation, the stark contrast between Dr. Minor's elite intellect and his severe psychological collapse left investigators entirely baffled. Minor did not deny pulling the trigger, yet he expressed no remorse for the brutal killing. In a calm, clinical tone, the former military surgeon explained that the murder was a justified act of self-defense. He meticulously detailed how unseen assassins had been breaking into his London boarding house night after night, hiding in the ceiling and attempting to poison his sleep. He firmly believed that Merritt was one of these phantom tormentors sent to extract revenge for perceived grievances from his past. The British authorities found themselves paralyzed, unequipped to process a high-profile foreign national whose brilliant medical mind was entirely fractured by severe paranoid delusions. The subsequent trial at the Central Criminal Court, widely known as the Old Bailey, was swift and devoid of suspense. Defense psychiatrists easily demonstrated that the American surgeon was profoundly detached from reality, suffering from what would later be understood as severe schizophrenia. Early in April 1872, the judge delivered a verdict that spared Minor the hangman's noose, but sealed his fate in a far more agonizing way. The court ruled Minor not guilty by reason of insanity, banishing him to Broadmoor, a newly built facility that was quickly earning a reputation as the darkest hell in Victorian England. To understand the birth of the monster residing within Dr. Minor's mind, one must look far beyond the foggy cobblestones of Victorian London and across the Atlantic to a nation tearing itself apart. Born into a wealthy and deeply religious New England family, Miner was a man of immense intellect, graduating with a medical degree from Yale University in 1863. He was primed for a life of prestige and comfort, a scholar of literature and anatomy alike. Yet, destiny placed him at the exact epicenter of one of history's most brutal conflicts, the American Civil War. Commissioned as a surgeon for the Union Army, the young and sensitive physician was thrust into a theater of unrelenting carnage that would permanently fracture his psyche. The battlefield hospitals of the 1860s were less places of healing and more akin to industrial slaughterhouses. Deployed to the front lines during the extraordinarily bloody Battle of the Wilderness, Dr. Miner found himself wading through oceans of blood and shattered bone. Day after day, under the dim light of flickering lanterns and the deafening roar of artillery fire, he was forced to perform endless amputations on screaming, unanesthetized young men. He saw bodies torn asunder by cannon fire and severed limbs stacked like cordwood outside the sweltering medical tents. Worse still, as part of his military duties, he was reportedly ordered to brand the face of an Irish deserter with a hot iron, an act of extreme, intimate cruelty that haunted the empathetic doctor to his core. The sheer volume of death and the visceral reality of human destruction overwhelmed his senses, slowly eroding the boundaries of his sanity. In modern medical terms, the catastrophic trauma Miner endured on the battlefield would be classified as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition which subsequently triggered latent schizophrenia. As the war ended and the United States attempted to heal, Miner's mind spiraled into a dark, inescapable abyss. He began experiencing vivid, terrifying auditory and visual hallucinations. He became absolutely convinced that unseen enemies, often former Confederate soldiers or the Irishmen he had encountered during the war, were constantly hunting him. These phantom tormentors infiltrated his nights, slipping through locked doors to torture him, poison his food, and abuse him while he slept. Despite being admitted to various military asylums in the United States, his paranoia only deepened, transforming the brilliant Yale surgeon into a terrified, erratic shell of his former self who slept with a loaded revolver under his pillow. Desperate for a cure and hoping that a dramatic change of scenery might outpace his invisible assassins, Miner was permitted to travel to Europe, eventually settling in the quiet, atmospheric streets of London in 1871. He sought refuge in a life of quiet academic study, collecting rare books and painting. He believed he had finally left the bloodshed of the American Civil War far behind him. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had fled across the Atlantic to find peace, completely unaware that the devil had traveled with him, firmly rooted inside his own mind. A dark passenger that would inevitably force him through the cold iron gates of Broadmoor. When the heavy iron gates of Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum closed behind Dr. Miner in April 1872, he did not step into a medieval dungeon. Opened just 9 years earlier in 1863, the sprawling red brick complex in the quiet Berkshire countryside was originally designed as a beacon of progressive Victorian medicine. It was the first facility of its kind in England, a state-run psychiatric hospital specifically built for the criminally insane. The architects and physicians championed a revolutionary psychiatric philosophy known as moral treatment. This doctrine aggressively rejected the barbaric practices of the early 19th century, theoretically replacing the rusted iron shackles, heavy chains, and lightless isolation pits with structured agricultural labor, fresh air, and quiet reading. The institution was built on the optimistic illusion that even the most violent, fractured minds could be gently coaxed back to sanity through strict discipline and a calming environment. However, this utopian vision of psychiatric rehabilitation was immediately corrupted by the rigid class structures of the era, creating a bizarre reality for inmates possessing wealth. Because his psychological breakdown was directly linked to his traumatic medical service in the American Civil War, Dr. Miner continued to receive a substantial military pension from the United States government. This steady influx of foreign wealth shielded the American murderer from the harsh realities of penal institutionalization. Instead of being stripped of his dignity, Miner essentially purchased an aristocratic lifestyle from behind bars. Asylum authorities granted him an unprecedented level of privilege, allocating him 2 spacious, adjacent cells. He used one as a private sleeping quarter and transformed the other into a magnificent, sprawling study. He covered the sterile brick walls with custom-built, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, ultimately importing a massive collection of rare antiquarian books, fine art pieces, and expensive rugs from London. He was even permitted to use his military pension to pay poorer fellow inmates to clean his rooms and act as his personal servants. This grotesque disparity laid bare the profound hypocrisy embedded within the Victorian psychiatric system. While Dr. Miner spent his days painting delicate watercolors, playing his flute, and reading centuries-old literature in a sunlit private suite, the working class and destitute patients suffered a vastly different existence. Those without outside financial support were herded into overcrowded, chaotic, and increasingly unsanitary communal wards. They were forced to engage in grueling, unpaid physical labor in the asylum's massive washhouses, kitchens, and agricultural fields under the guise of therapeutic occupation. Broadmoor functioned less as a revolutionary medical hospital and much more as a strict microcosm of Victorian society, where even severe mental illness and criminal violence were aggressively segregated by financial worth. Yet, despite the manicured courtyard gardens and the illusion of polite moral treatment, the inherent psychological cruelty of permanent confinement could not be entirely masked. The progressive promises of the British medical establishment were merely a polite veneer covering systemic neglect and the slow decay of the human mind. But to truly comprehend the nightmarish reality of 19th century psychiatric care without the deceptive, softening filter of aristocratic wealth, one must strip away the velvet curtains of Broadmoor. To witness the unvarnished, brutal horror of the asylum system during this exact period, we must turn our gaze back across the Atlantic, returning directly to the place Dr. Miner had fled. The United States. Earlier in the 19th century, the United States faced an identical, catastrophic crisis regarding the treatment of its most psychologically vulnerable citizens. Before the concept of the modern hospital existed, the mentally ill in America were subjected to unimaginably barbaric conditions. Dorothea Dix, a pioneering and relentless American social reformer, spent years traveling the country and documenting these horrors, eventually testifying before the United States Congress. She painted a harrowing picture of individuals chained in unlit, freezing cellars, locked inside iron animal cages, and brutally beaten alongside violent, hardened criminals in local county jails. Her impassioned, highly publicized pleas ignited a nationwide reform movement, leading directly to the establishment of over 30 state psychiatric hospitals. Much like Broadmoor in England, These sprawling American institutions were originally founded on the noble premise of humane rehabilitation, promising a safe sanctuary where the fractured minds of the nation could be medically treated rather than criminally punished. However, by the late 1880s, this progressive transatlantic dream had entirely collapsed under the crushing weight of severe underfunding, political apathy, and massive, unmanageable overcrowding. These state-funded sanctuaries rapidly deteriorated into impenetrable mental prisons, completely shielded from the scrutiny of the outside world. In 1887, the grim, secretive reality of these American institutions was violently dragged into the public light by an ambitious 23-year-old investigative journalist named Nellie Bly. Determined to uncover the hidden truth of the asylum system from the inside out, Bly undertook a highly dangerous undercover assignment. She intentionally faked a severe psychiatric breakdown, meticulously practicing erratic behavior and a vacant stare until she successfully deceived multiple medical professionals and judges. As a result, she was involuntarily committed to the notorious Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island, situated in the freezing waters of New York's East River. What Bly documented during her time inside the facility, later published as the explosive journalistic exposé 10 Days in a Madhouse, profoundly horrified the American public and triggered immediate government investigations. She revealed a systemic, inescapable nightmare where perfectly sane, impoverished women were trapped alongside the dangerously ill, all subjected to daily, methodical psychological and physical torture. Bly detailed how patients were stripped naked and forced into freezing, filthy ice baths by aggressive attendants, a suffocating process that felt terrifyingly akin to drowning. The inmates were fed rotting, spoiled meat and moldy bread and were strictly forbidden from speaking or moving for hours on end, forced to sit upright on hard wooden benches in absolute, freezing silence. The nurses, functioning more as sadistic, unchecked wardens than medical caregivers, routinely choked, kicked, and beat the vulnerable women in their care, knowing they were entirely insulated from any legal or external oversight. The terrifying abuses that Nellie Bly exposed on Blackwell's Island were not an isolated American tragedy. Rather, they provided a precise, terrifying mirror reflecting the dark, hidden corners of Broadmoor and the global psychiatric system of the Victorian era. Behind the high, imposing red brick walls and the carefully manicured lawns in Berkshire, the exact same unchecked authority allowed attendants to systematically brutalize the voiceless and the forgotten. The working-class inmates at Broadmoor, those lacking Dr. Miner's protective wealth, suffered the exact same suffocating isolation, the same gross physical neglect, and the same absolute loss of human autonomy that Bly had narrowly survived in New York. The original philosophy of moral treatment had devolved into a mechanism of absolute control, where any minor infraction or display of actual psychiatric symptoms was met with swift, violent retribution. The overarching system, whether operating in London or New York, was no longer designed to cure the human mind. It was mechanically designed to break the human spirit, silently warehousing society's unwanted out of sight and out of mind. Yet, while thousands of destitute patients slowly languished and deteriorated in the squalor of these transatlantic nightmares, Dr. William Chester Miner sat quietly in his lavish, heated, book-lined cell. Protected by his military pension and insulated from the brutal beatings happening just down the corridor, the American surgeon was not merely passing the time in a heavily guarded void. Surrounded by the distant, echoing screams of the forgotten, he had miraculously found the one solitary escape route from the absolute hell of the Victorian asylum system. An escape route that did not require a physical key, but rather a profound, consuming obsession with the English language. In the early 1880s, a seemingly insignificant piece of printed paper slipped through the heavily guarded iron walls of Broadmoor, permanently altering the trajectory of English literary history. Dr. Miner, isolated in his lavishly funded dual-cell library, discovered a formal pamphlet enclosed within one of his regular antiquarian book deliveries from London. It was an ambitious, nationwide appeal from the Philological Society. They were embarking on an impossibly massive academic undertaking, compiling the first comprehensive, historically accurate dictionary of the English language, a monumental project that would eventually become the legendary Oxford English Dictionary. The editors desperately needed educated volunteers to read centuries of obscure literature and extract precise quotations demonstrating the exact evolving usage of specific words. For a highly educated, meticulously organized surgeon trapped in an infinite loop of monotonous confinement, this was not merely a scholarly request. It was a psychological lifeline, offering a tether to the sane world he had violently left behind. Miner seized the academic project with a ferocity that bordered on absolute clinical obsession. Stripped permanently of his surgical scalpel, the American doctor turned his razor-sharp analytical mind entirely toward the science of lexicography. He spent his days sitting at his heavy mahogany desk, completely surrounded by towering stacks of 16th and 17th century texts purchased utilizing his United States military pension. He meticulously built a bespoke, highly complex indexing system, tracking thousands of obscure words, tracing their etymological roots, and capturing their exact contextual usage. Over the next 2 decades, Miner mailed more than 10,000 painstakingly handwritten slips of paper from his Berkshire cell directly to the dictionary's central headquarters in Oxford. His contributions were consistently flawless, providing the definitive historical context for complex words that had completely baffled the project's foremost linguistic experts. At the very center of this monumental academic undertaking was Dr. James Murray, the dictionary's brilliant and fiercely dedicated chief editor. Murray was profoundly grateful for the relentless tide of perfect, highly erudite quotations arriving steadily from an address listed simply as Broadmoor, Crowthorne, Berkshire, having absolutely no reason to suspect otherwise. The distinguished editor naturally assumed that his most prolific and reliable correspondent was a retired medical professional or a quietly eccentric country gentleman enjoying a life of scholarly leisure. The polite postal address revealed absolutely nothing of the barred windows, the screaming inmates, or the violent, chaotic reality of the state psychiatric hospital. Murray publicly praised his mysterious contributor on multiple occasions, frequently noting in academic circles that the Oxford English Dictionary simply could not progress at its current, rigorous pace without the astonishing, tireless dedication of Dr. William Chester Miner, driven by profound professional respect and a desire to honor his greatest contributor. Dr. Murray eventually decided he must personally meet the brilliant scholar who had become the invisible backbone of his life's work. In January 1891, the distinguished Oxford editor boarded a train to Berkshire, expecting to be warmly welcomed into a grand, comfortable countryside manor. Instead, his horse-drawn carriage pulled up to the towering, forbidding red brick gates of England's most notorious criminal asylum. When Murray was escorted into the austere facility by the medical superintendent, he logically anticipated discovering that Dr. Minor was a senior staff physician treating the inmates. The historic twist that followed left the brilliant lexicographer utterly speechless. He was led down a secure, heavily guarded corridor and formally introduced to his greatest intellectual collaborator, a paranoid, diagnosed schizophrenic who had brutally gunned down an innocent father on the foggy streets of London. The extraordinary, decades-long partnership between the esteemed Oxford academic and the convicted American murderer remains one of the most astonishing paradoxes in literary history. Yet, the sterile comfort of academic validation and the bright, guiding light of intellectual pursuit could not permanently suppress the severe psychological rot festering beneath the surface. Dr. Minor could define tens of thousands of complex words with absolute surgical precision, but he could not define, contain, or control the relentless, terrifying delusions consuming his own mind. When the heavy cell doors locked and the gas lamps were extinguished each night, the scholarly gentleman vanished. In the suffocating darkness of the Victorian Asylum, the monster inside Dr. Minor returned, and it began demanding a horrifying, visceral tribute of blood. As the dawn of the 20th century approached, the fragile intellectual tether that had kept Dr. Minor connected to reality finally began to snap. The thousands of index cards and scholarly letters could no longer drown out the deafening roar of his untreated schizophrenia. By 1902, his paranoid delusions had escalated into a terrifying, inescapable waking nightmare. The phantom tormentors from his American Civil War days returned with unprecedented ferocity, no longer just watching him, but actively assaulting him. Minor became absolutely convinced that invisible entities were slipping through the heavy brickwork of his Broadmoor cell each night, paralyzing him in his bed and subjecting him to horrific sexual abuse. He documented these night terrors in agonizing detail, claiming that demons were systematically corrupting his soul and forcing him to commit unspeakable sins against his deeply ingrained religious morality. Driven to the absolute brink by sheer exhaustion and a frantic, distorted sense of religious guilt, the brilliant surgeon made a catastrophic decision. On a freezing morning in December 1902, Minor concluded that the only way to sever his connection to these demonic forces was to physically purify himself. Taking up the very instrument that had defined his scholarly salvation, a sharp, metal penknife he routinely used to slice open the uncut pages of his rare antiquarian books, the 58-year-old man committed an act of unimaginable self-mutilation. In a sudden, violent frenzy of psychotic clarity, Dr. Minor utilized his fading anatomical expertise to cleanly sever his own genitals. When the Broadmoor medical attendants finally discovered the bleeding, mutilated scholar collapsed in his lavish cell. The horrifying scene instantly shattered the institution's polite Victorian facade. This gruesome, undeniable climax proved unequivocally that the heavily romanticized doctrine of moral treatment was a complete medical failure. The manicured courtyard gardens, the quiet reading hours, and the illusion of therapeutic labor had done absolutely nothing to halt or heal the profound neurological decay festering inside the inmates' minds. The state-of-the-art asylum had merely functioned as a sophisticated, brick-walled containment unit, locking a profoundly sick man in a dark room with the very demons that were actively destroying him. There is a profound, lingering tragedy in the image of a Yale-educated medical prodigy reduced to such barbaric desperation on the cold floor of an English asylum. Dr. William Chester Minor, a man whose boundless intellect helped map the entirety of the English language, had been utterly abandoned by the psychiatric establishment of his era. He was a tragic casualty not only of the bloody, traumatic battlefields of the American Civil War, but of a hopelessly primitive global medical system that prioritized physical containment over actual psychological salvation, leaving a certified genius to be eaten alive by his own fractured mind. After decades of relentless confinement and the devastating physical toll of his untreated illness, the frail and elderly Dr. Minor was finally permitted to leave Broadmoor. In 1910, on the direct orders of the British Home Secretary, he was released from the psychiatric facility and deported back to the United States. However, there was no triumphant redemption or peaceful freedom waiting for him across the Atlantic. He simply traded one barred window for another, spending his final, fading years in total isolation at an asylum in Connecticut. The brilliant Yale surgeon and convicted murderer passed away quietly in 1920, leaving behind a complex, heavily shadowed legacy. His tragic demise, mirroring the countless forgotten souls of the Victorian era, forces us to confront the dark, bloody history of institutions like Broadmoor in England and Blackwell's Island in America. These sprawling, state-funded facilities were originally erected on the optimistic promise of humane medical healing, but their high stone walls ultimately served only to hide society's most vulnerable individuals from the public eye. Instead of curing the shattered mind, the brutal isolation, systemic physical abuse, and suffocating confinement of the 19th century asylum system often exacerbated the very madness they claimed to treat. They were not sanctuaries of progressive medicine, but rather imposing monuments to a deeply flawed, callous, and heavily experimental age of psychiatry. The next time you casually open the Oxford English Dictionary to trace the precise historical meaning of a word, pause for a moment to consider its origin. Remember that the very definition you are reading may have been painstakingly drafted in the freezing, shadowy cell of a schizophrenic murderer, meticulously writing by the flickering, dying light of a solitary candle. If you'd like to support the show, please leave a thumbs up, comment, rating, or review. Patreon supporters get access to ad-free audio-only episodes, and you can also sign up separately to my free newsletter via my website for news and updates. I'll leave the links in the show notes. Thanks for your support, and I'll see you again soon.